The candles in Mrs. Aldgate's drawing room burned in pairs along the mantelpiece, and the assembled ladies of the Bath Charitable Reading Circle sat in their accustomed arrangement. The silk gowns occupied the chairs near the fire, the muslin gowns, the chairs toward the windows, and Miss Cecily Vane, the single wooden chair beside the bookcase, where the light was good and the distance from Lady Pembridge was greatest. It was the 3rd Thursday of November in the year 1812, and the rain had come in from the west and settled over the city like a judgment. Cecily held her volume of sermons in her gloved hands and waited for Mrs. Aldgate to call the page, and she noticed, without allowing her expression to alter, that Lady Pembridge had not looked at her once since the gathering began. This was not unusual. What was unusual was the gentleman who had been admitted to the outer hall at the quarter hour and had not yet departed, and whose low voice Cecily could hear at intervals through the closed door speaking to Mrs. Benamy. Aldgate's housekeeper in the measured tones of a man accustomed to being attended to without raising his voice. She did not know then whose voice it was. She would learn shortly. Lady Pembridge set her own volume aside and surveyed the room with the equanimity of a woman who has never required a reason to be attended to. She was 58 years old, upright and formidably postured, and she wore a deep plum silk gown with Brussels lace at the throat and a diamond brooch at her collar that caught the candlelight in small, deliberate flashes. The ivory fan in her right hand was held at precisely the height she had determined 20 years ago, communicated authority without effort. When she spoke, it was not loudly. It was never loudly, Miss Vane, she said. I am afraid this circle has outgrown its present accommodations. We are reforming under private subscription, and the membership will naturally be confined to those of appropriate station. She opened the fan with a single motion. You will find other occupation for your Thursday evenings, I am sure. A solicitor's daughter and nothing more will discover society enough among the clerks' wives. The room did not gasp. The room had learned, in Lady Pembridge's presence, to absorb its own reactions. Cecily rose from the wooden chair. Her hands were steady. Her face, she knew from long practice, was composed. She said, "Thank you for the instruction, my lady," and she took her pelisse from the peg near the door. And she opened the door into the outer hall. The gentleman standing there was the Earl of Ashmore. She knew him at once from the portrait she had seen in her father's office, though that portrait had been painted 15 years ago, and the man before her was 40 years sold in everything but his record, which said 36. He was tall and broad-shouldered with a military bearing held in careful civilian restraint, and his dark navy tailcoat was fitted with the exactness of a man who attends to details because details are the only things that hold when everything else has gone. His dark brown hair was worn short and close-cropped with a slight wave at the temples, and he had a thin horizontal scar through his left eyebrow from some old accident that the portrait had not yet had occasion to record. His dark gray eyes regarded her with a steadiness that was not unkind and not warm. It was simply accurate. He stepped aside to allow her passage to the street, and he said nothing. Cecily walked past him into the wet November evening. She did not know whether he had heard. She found with some distance that she could not decide which possibility was worse. She had been born in Bath 24 years ago, in the house above her father's office in Milsom Street, and she had grown up among ledgers and legal copywork, and the careful language of instruments and codicils, and she had understood before she could articulate it that the law was the grammar of the world in which she lived, the syntax by which property moved from hand to hand, and obligation was recorded and debt was assigned its proper address. Her father, Mr. George Vane, had been a solicitor of integrity and considerable skill, and he had served the Ashmore family in their Wiltshire affairs for 11 years, and when he died of a fever in the January of 1811, he had left behind him 2 things of substance. One was a modest debt. The other was a cabinet of papers so meticulously organized that his partner, Mr. Jonas Hartley, had wept at the sight of them. Cecily had cleared the debt herself. It had taken 8 months of work for Mr. Romade. Hartley at rates. She had negotiated with her own voice in that same office, and she had not wept at anything, and she had not told anyone what it had cost her to sit at her father's desk and speak in her father's tongue to a man who was not her father. She had simply done it. And then she had continued doing it, because the work was there, and she was capable of it, and there was no alternative she could see that would not require her to accept charity from people who would remind her of it. She was, as Lady Pembridge had observed, a solicitor's daughter, and nothing more. The market had made its assessment early, and had not reconsidered it. She was 24, with a dead father and a cleared debt, and no portion and no connections and no beauty of the sort the season considered actionable. The season wanted daughters, with estates behind them, or at minimum. Daughters with mothers behind them, women who knew how to steer a girl through the machinery of introductions and morning calls and the particular choreography of a Bath assembly. Cecily had none of that. She had her father's teaching, and her father's honesty, and the habit of precision she had acquired watching him work, which was not nothing, but was also not the sort of thing that had a visible price in the current market. She was neat. She was accurate. She had hazel eyes with green predominating, and chestnut hair. She dressed herself in a simple updo each morning, and she had at the right forefinger a faint callus from the hours she spent copying documents at Hartley's long oak table. She had learned not to think about what the callus signified beyond the work itself. The work was honest. She was good at it. These were facts, and she attended to facts. The Ashmore estate papers had arrived at Hartley's office in September. They came by carrier from Wiltshire in 4 crates, and they represented 11 years of her father's careful service, and Hartley had set her to cataloguing them in order of date and instrument type, which was the work she had been doing every morning since the leaves turned. The Earl had come himself in early October, which was not expected. The previous Earl had conducted all his legal affairs by correspondence and occasional proxy, but the new Earl, it seemed, preferred to attend to things directly. He arrived on a Tuesday without announcement, which meant Cecily was at the long oak table in her plain cream gown, with the narrow green ribbon at the bodice, her white gloves laid aside while she turned pages, and she looked up when the door opened and met his gray eyes for the second time. He did not appear to recall the first. He sat across the table from her while Hartley reviewed the outline of the estate affairs, and he asked precise questions in low, even sentences and took no notes, which meant he retained everything without needing to, and he looked at the documents she placed before him and read them with his whole attention, which was the quality she had noticed in him that she could not name as anything other than discipline. He did not perform attention, he simply gave it. He came back on Thursday, and on the following Tuesday. He did not speak to her beyond necessity. He said, on one occasion, "That figure is copied from the wrong column," and she looked, and he was correct, and she corrected it without discussion, and he returned to his reading. She noticed that he never repeated an instruction, which meant he trusted that things done once would be done again, and she was not sure whether this was efficiency or a kind of austere respect, and she decided it did not matter. On the 3rd visit he brought with him a letter from his late father's steward in Wiltshire, and he laid it on the table and said, without looking up from the estate ledger, "This appears to reference a bequest your father was managing. I should like to understand it." She took the letter. She read it in 30 seconds. She told him which folder would contain the relevant instrument, and he looked at her for the first time with something other than the neutral precision he distributed to every paper in the room. The look lasted approximately 3 seconds. Then he looked at the folder. On another occasion, a client of Hartley's arrived in some distress and left behind a small purse on the bench in the entrance passage, and Cecily retrieved it and sent Hartley's clerk running into the street after the client. And when she returned to the table, the Earl was watching her from the doorway with an expression she could not read and did not try to. She sat down and picked up her pen and returned to the folio she had been copying. She heard him return to his chair. Neither of them spoke of it. She was reading the Ashmore papers at the rate of approximately 40 folios per morning. By the 5th week she had reached the instruments from 1810, the year before her father's death. And it was in the 3rd folder of the 5th week, on a wet Wednesday afternoon, that she found the codicil. It was dated the 14th of March, 1811, 10 days before her father died. It purported to be a supplement to the 4th Earl of Ashmore's will, and it redirected a small legacy, specifically a sum of £400, and a cottage at Whitmere in Wiltshire, away from the beneficiary named in the original will, who was Miss Cecily Vane, daughter of George Vane, solicitor. 1. And recognition of certain services to the late Earl. Her father had never mentioned a codicil. Her father had never mentioned a legacy in the Ashmore will. She sat very still for a long moment, and then she looked at the signature, at the foot of the document. She had copied enough of the Ashmore papers by then to know the 4th Earl's signature with her hands closed. The signature on this codicil was not the 4th Earl's. It was not even an adequate attempt. It was a careful hand that had tried to reproduce something it had seen elsewhere in the family papers, and it had reproduced the wrong thing entirely. The signature was Edward Ashmore's, the 5th Earl, the living man. The man who sat across the table from her on Tuesdays and Thursdays and asked precise questions in a low, even voice. Someone had forged a living peer's signature on a document purporting to be his dead father's will. She sat with her hands flat on the table for the remainder of the afternoon, and she did not speak of it, and she did not show her face in any direction that would require it to carry an expression. And when Hartley came to lock the outer door, she told him she was tired, and went home to her 2 rooms in Brock Street, laid the matter out in her mind the way her father had taught her to lay out a legal question. Facts first, then the instrument, then the parties, then the consequence. The facts were these. The Ashmore estate papers included a fraudulent codicil bearing a forged signature. The beneficiary named in the original will, who had received nothing, was herself. The beneficiary named in the fraudulent codicil, who had presumably received something, was Lady Agatha Pembridge. The signature forged was that of the 5th Earl of Ashmore, a living man, on an instrument purporting to derive from his deceased father. The person who had forged it did not know that the 2 men's signatures were different, which meant she had not sat at a long oak table for 5 weeks learning every pen stroke of both. She had copied what she thought was a dead man's name and had, in fact, copied his son's. She had not, until that moment, understood the full weight of what her father had been keeping for her. The legacy was small by the standards of the Ashmore estate. £400 was nevertheless a year's income for a woman in her position. And the cottage at Whitmere was a specific place, named and described in the original will with the care her father had given to everything he valued. He had known about it. He had kept it in his papers without telling her, which she understood now to mean that he had intended to tell her himself at the proper time. And the fever had arrived before he could. She thought about that for a long time. She did not think about Lady Pembridge. Lady Pembridge was a consequence to be managed. What she thought about was her father's handwriting on the original will, which she had read in the 2nd folder of the 4th week. It was exactly as she had known it all her life. The letters formed with care, each instrument as if it might be the last record of something that mattered. Because in his experience every instrument was. She thought she ought to go home. She sat at the table a little longer instead. Cecily lay awake until 3 in the morning listening to the rain. If she told Hartley, Hartley would report it to the Earl and the Earl would act on it in whatever direction the law and his own judgment indicated, and Lady Pembridge would be exposed and prosecuted. Or she would be quietly confronted, and the matter resolved to the Earl's satisfaction, which was the more probable outcome among men of rank. Either way, the truth would be known. If she said nothing, the forged codicil would continue to sit in the Ashmore papers, and eventually the estate would be settled, and the matter of the small legacy would come to light in its redirected form. And Cecily would have preserved a secret that was not hers, and protected a woman who had stood in Mrs. Mater Aldgate's candlelit drawing room, and told her in front of 9 witnesses to go back to her gutter. She did not sleep. By morning, she knew what she would do. The assembly rooms on a Friday evening in November were lit with 140 candles in the upper chandelier alone, and the music from the orchestra carried through the ante-room and the tea-room and the card-room in distinct diminishing registers. And the company that moved through these spaces was the usual Bath assembly of invalids in excellent health, and officers in excellent spirits, and matrons in excellent gowns. And at the center of it, as was her custom, Lady Pembridge held a small court near the far wall, with her niece, Miss Lavinia Stroud, arranged at her right hand like a very beautiful supporting argument. Cecily had come because Hartley's wife had asked her, and she had no reason to refuse that she could name aloud. She wore her cream gown and her borrowed Spencer jacket, and her worn gloves, and she moved along the edge of the room, with the quiet efficiency of a woman who has learned that the perimeter is safer than the center. And she accepted a glass of negus from a passing tray, and stood near the pillar, and watched the room do what rooms in this period did, which was render its verdicts, in the language of arrangement and proximity, and degrees of acknowledgment. She was perhaps 20 minutes into the evening when Miss Trent, a rector's daughter she had known since childhood, appeared at her elbow with the careful expression of a woman bearing information she is not sure how to carry. "I thought you should know," Miss Trent said low and rapid, "that Lady Pembridge told Mrs. Featherwick this afternoon that a solicitor's daughter and nothing more has been circulating in the assembly rooms under the impression that good society cannot distinguish between a gentleman's family and a clerk's. I believe she meant you, Cecily. I am sorry." Cecily did not look at Lady Pembridge. She looked at her negus and said, "Thank you, Anne." And Miss Trent pressed her hand and moved away. 2 hours later at the dinner table in Laura Place, Lady Pembridge exercised the authority of rank. She had arranged the dinner with her usual precision. 12 covers had been laid, the Earl of Ashmore at her right hand, her niece Miss Stroud at his, and Cecily, who had come at the invitation of the solicitor Hartley and his wife, placed at the far end of the table with 2 clergymen and their wives. The dinner had been proceeding for 40 minutes when Lady Pembridge, in the pause between the second course and the suite, turned the conversation to the question of Bath's charitable institutions, and remarked that certain persons had a habit of attaching themselves to circles and gatherings for which their connections did not qualify them, and that she hoped the present company would forgive her for observing that a table of this nature ought not to have required the clarification she had recently been obliged to offer. She looked, as she said this, at no one in particular, which was the most efficient way to ensure that everyone understood whom she meant. The Earl of Ashmore set down his wine-glass. He did not look at Cecily. He looked at Lady Pembridge with the particular quality of grey attention she had first seen in Hartley's office, which was not expression and not blankness, but a state of total reception that had no visible floor. He said nothing. Lady Pembridge continued to speak, with the composed confidence of a woman who has never had reason to expect that a remark of this kind would be challenged in her own dining-room, and her niece smiled at the Earl with the patient smile of a woman who has been told she is the correct answer and has been waiting a long time for the question to be asked in the proper form. Cecily excused herself at the earliest decency permitted it. She collected her pelisse and went out into the street. The city was cold and quiet, and the stones were wet with the night's first frost, and she walked the length of Laura Place without hurrying, and turned toward Brock Street, and did not stop until she reached her own door. She stood in the dark of her parlor for a long time with her coat still on, and the leather document wallet was on the table where she had left it that morning, and she looked at it for a long time. A solicitor's daughter, and nothing more. Lady Pembridge had said it, with the relaxed confidence of a woman who had never needed to mean a thing twice. Cecily looked at the wallet. Inside it was a fraudulent instrument bearing a living man's forged signature, and inside the original Ashmore will, which was in Hartley's cabinet, was a small legacy that had been redirected, without her knowledge or consent, by a woman who had then spent 2 months arranging for society to regard her as a person who could safely be dismissed. She did not find this ironic. She found it factual, and facts, her father had taught her, were not occasions for satisfaction or bitterness. They were occasions for action. In the morning, she would take the wallet to Hartley's office. That was what she had decided. She would place it on the table, and she would tell Hartley where she had found it, and what she believed it to be, and Hartley was a man of sense and probity, and he would know what to do, and it would be out of her hands. and she could return to her copying at the long oak table and complete the work her father had left her to do, and that would be that. She was aware that this decision was the correct one. She was also aware that it cost her something she could not name precisely, because naming it would require sitting with it longer than she intended to, and the evening was cold and the kettle was on and she was very tired. She set the kettle and sat down beside it, and let the warmth come back into her hands. There was one other thing she had not told Hartley, or anyone. In the second week of November, on a cold, bright morning, when the estate papers had brought her to a reference she needed to verify in the church register at Walcott, she had gone to the churchyard at 8:15, before the frost had left the grass, and she had found the Earl of Ashmore standing at a grave in the far corner beneath the yew trees. He was alone. He stood without moving, in his dark navy coat and his polished boots, and his hat was in his hands and his face was turned toward the stone, in a way that had nothing to do with the careful precision he wore in Hartley's office. He looked like a man who had been standing there a long time and did not know how to stop. She would have retreated had the gravel not shifted under her foot. He turned. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then she said, because silence in that churchyard at that hour seemed the worst discourtesy, "I beg your pardon, my lord, I had business with the register." He looked at her with the gray eyes that were, she saw now, not composed but enduring, which was a different thing. He said, "Charlotte," and then stopped, and cleared his throat, and said, "My wife. She and the child are both here." She said nothing, because there was nothing adequate to say, and he seemed to understand that her silence was not avoidance but respect, because he looked back at the stone and said in the same even voice he used at the table, "She was afraid I would not get back in time. She did not tell me. I believe she thought she was protecting me from worry." Cecily looked at the grave. The stone was simple, which was a choice a man of his means would have made deliberately. She said, "She sounds like a woman of considerable kindness." He did not answer immediately. When he did, he said, "Yes," with a plainness that made the word carry more weight than a eulogy would have. She went to the church register and did her business and came out, and he was gone, and she walked back to Brock Street with the transcript folded in her pocket and the cold of the churchyard still in her hands, and she thought about the particular quality of grief that makes a person stand still, and she thought about her father, and she did not permit herself to think about anything. Beyond that, she did not know that the Earl of Ashmore had left Laura Place 12 minutes after she had. She did not know that he had walked rather than taken a chair, which was unlike him, and that he had walked in the direction of Brock Street before turning back, which he had noted with a certain interior irritation that was the closest thing to self-recognition he had permitted himself in 22 months. His wife, Charlotte, had died in March of 1811, 8 days after a son who did not survive. He had been in Wiltshire at the time, called away from London by the news of his father's declining health, and she had not told him how close the confinement was, or rather, she had told him she was well and he had trusted her assessment as he had trusted her in everything, and he had been in the carriage when the letter caught him on the road. He had had, since then, a particular distrust of his own capacity for assessment. He had decided, carefully and with what he considered appropriate deliberation, that what he trusted was evidence, documents, instruments, the specifics of things that could be verified. He had not expected to find in a Bath solicitor's outer office a woman who read legal instruments with the same trust. She did not perform efficiency. She simply applied it. And when the client had left his purse on the bench and she had sent the clerk running after him, the Earl had stood in the doorway and felt something shift in him that he had not been prepared for, which was the recognition that this particular quality, the quality of acting from one's values without consulting the room first, was rarer than he had admitted. He had gone home to his lodgings in Gay Street and sat with a glass of port and thought about it rather more than he had intended to. He did not go to bed until late, and when he rose in the morning, he dressed with his usual exactness and walked to Hartley's office rather earlier than the appointed hour. Cecily arrived at 9:20 to find him already there. She stopped in the doorway. She had the document wallet under her arm. He was standing at the window with a cup of tea Hartley's clerk had apparently provided, and he turned when she entered, and looked at her with that same gray accuracy that had no warm quality and no cold quality, and was simply complete attention, and she crossed to the table and set the document wallet down. "I have something to show Mr. Hartley," she said, "and I think it concerns you, my lord. You may as well be present." She opened the wallet. She extracted the codicil and laid it flat on the table. She placed beside it one of the 4th Earl's authenticated instruments from the first folder, and she placed beside that one of the 5th Earl's own recent papers from the 2nd crate. She said the document at the center is represented as a codicil to your late father's will, dated the 14th of March, 1811. You will observe that the signature on the codicil does not match the signatures on either of the authentic instruments I have set beside it. It most closely resembles the signature on your own paper, my lord. Your own paper, not your father's. He put down the tea. He came to the table and he looked at the 3 documents with the same quality of attention he gave. Everything, complete and exact. His eyes moved from the codicil to the authenticated instrument, to his own paper, and back to the codicil. She watched his hand, which lay flat on the table edge, perfectly still. In Hartley's office she had learned to read the Earl through his hands. They were the one part of him that was not always controlled. He was very still for a long interval, and then he looked at Cecily with something in his face that was not yet readable, as any of the things she might have expected, which were anger, or relief, or calculation. He said, "When did you find this?" "3 days ago." She said, "And you sat on it 3 days. I was deciding what to do. Why did you decide to bring it to Hartley?" She looked at him. "Because it is the correct instrument," she said. "The law is the correct instrument, not my own preferences, not my situation, not the fact that the codicil has cost me something I did not know I was owed. The correct instrument is the law." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The legacy. The cottage at Whitmere. That is yours. The codicil rejects it. The codicil is fraudulent." She said nothing, because he was correct. He picked up the codicil. He held it at a specific angle in the window light, as if reading something in the paper itself, and then he set it down with the deliberate exactness of a man who knows what he intends to do next, and is measuring the gap between this moment and that action. He said, "Miss Vane, I am going to the assembly rooms this evening." She said, "Yes. My Lord Lady Pembridge will be there. She usually is." He looked at her with an expression that was not warmth, exactly, but was something adjacent to it, the way a fire at some distance is not warmth, but is not absence either. He said, "I think you should be there as well." She did not know what he meant by that. She knew that she would go. The assembly rooms on a Monday evening were less formal than a Friday, and the company was comfortable with itself, and Lady Pembridge had positioned herself near the music with her niece and 2 matrons of her acquaintance, and she was in the full exercise of her social authority when the Earl of Ashmore entered the room. He was not announced. He walked through the doorway in his dark navy tailcoat with the brass buttons, and the thin horizontal scar through his left eyebrow was visible in the chandelier light. And he was alone, and he looked once at the room, the whole of it. And then he looked at Cecily, who was standing near the pillar where she had stood on Friday. And he crossed the room toward her. Lady Pembridge saw him coming. She lifted her fan to the height she had determined. 20 years ago communicated authority without effort. He did not stop at her court. He did not pause or alter direction. He crossed the full width of the room with the measured stride of a man who has considered this distance and found it adequate, and he came to stand before Cecily at the pillar. The distance between them was less than decorum prescribed. She could see the thin horizontal scar through his left eyebrow in the chandelier light, and his dark gray eyes on her face, with the quality of attention she had come to know across a long oak table, which was total and without performance and had no floor she had been able to find. The room had by now performed the particular collective stilling that a room performs when it recognizes that something is happening that it will be required to have witnessed. The orchestra played on for a bar or 2 and then trailed, and in the quiet the only sound was the candles in the upper chandelier and the sound of the assembly rooms thinking. He did not look at the room. He looked at her. "Poor," he said, "Miss Vane is the woman I intend to marry." 9 words. They landed in the silence his approach had built, and they fell into the room the way a document falls on a table when it has been signed, when it is final, when the matter is settled. Lady Pembridge's fan, stilled at mid-air. Her niece, Miss Stroud, turned toward her with an expression that was the first genuinely unguarded thing she had worn in 2 seasons. A small, startled blankness that was not yet grief, but was its immediate antechamber. The matrons near the wall exchanged a glance. Cecily looked at the Earl of Ashmore, and she said, low and level, "My lord, you are not required to do this." He said, "I am aware of that." She looked at him for a long moment, and her hands were not entirely steady, and she felt in her chest the particular sensation of something that had been held under pressure for a very long time finding, without warning, that the pressure had released, and she did not know what to do with the sudden lightness of it. She said, "Then I accept." He gave a slight nod, which was the closest thing to relief she had yet seen on his face. Behind them, Lady Pembridge rose from her chair. She said, in a voice that was still composed and still technically polite, "My lord, I feel compelled to observe that Miss Vane is a solicitor's daughter and nothing more, and that she can hardly be considered inappropriate." And she did not finish the sentence because the Earl turned at last to look at her, and whatever she found in his gray eyes made her complete the sentence with the fan, instead closing it with a small, precise, final snap. The room watched her cross to the door. It watched in the particular collective silence of a group that has revised its understanding of events. Mr. McCade N. Hartley, who had arrived late and was standing near the tea-room entrance, saw and understood everything, and, being a man of sense, said nothing. The matter of the forged codicil resolved in the manner that such matters tended to resolve among persons of rank in the year 1812, which is to say, quietly and with documentation. Lady Pembridge was visited by the Earl's solicitor in London, and then by the Earl's own solicitor in Bath, and the contents of those visits were not made public, but their outcome was, she withdrew from Bath before the New Year. Her niece went to stay with relations in Devonshire. The diamond brooch at her collar was not. It was noted by those who noticed these things in evidence at the few public gatherings she attended thereafter. The cottage at Whitmere was restored to its proper beneficiary by legal instrument in December, which was the correct instrument, as Cecily had always known. She did not move into it at once. There were arrangements to be made, and a settlement to be drawn up with a care that Hartley undertook with a gravity appropriate to the occasion, and a period of some weeks during which the Earl came to Hartley's office in the mornings, not to review the estate papers, but to sit across the table from her and drink the tea that Hartley's clerk provided, and to speak in the low, even sentences she had come to know, and occasionally to say something to her directly that was not about the instruments on the table, and to which she responded in the direct, honest register she had always reserved for moments when her values were more important than her composure. He told her once in the quiet of a Tuesday afternoon when Hartley had gone out, that Charlotte had been afraid of the dark, and that he had kept a candle on until she was asleep, and he had come home from Wiltshire to an empty room with the candle burned down to nothing, and he had not known how to speak of it until now. He said this looking at the window. Cecily said nothing for a moment, and then she placed her hand over his, where it rested on the table, and the warmth of the contact went through her glove and his, and she felt his hand turn beneath hers to hold it. They sat like that for a long time, and outside the rain came in from the west, and settled over Bath, and neither of them moved. The cottage at Whitmere had a parlor with a low ceiling and a fireplace of gray stone and a window that looked east over the fields toward the woods, and in the January that followed the assembly room it was furnished simply, which was appropriate to it. And the leather document wallet sat on the small table by the window where Cecily had placed it the day they arrived, not as any kind of demonstration, but because it was her father's. And her father had served the Ashmore estate with integrity for 11 years, and it seemed right that his wallet should be in the house. The fire was burning low, and the frost had come up from the fields and touched the glass of the east window, and Edward sat in the chair beside the hearth, with his long legs extended toward the warmth, and he was reading something, some document from the estate. Boss, and his dark brown hair was slightly disordered, and the thin scar through his left eyebrow caught the firelight in a narrow line, and he looked up when she came in with the candle. He said cold. She said, yes. She set the candle on the mantelpiece and sat in the chair beside his, and the fire settled with a small sound, and outside, the frost continued its quiet work on the glass. She looked at the document wallet on the table by the window. In the last light, it was simply a worn brown leather case with a brass clasp gone to green at the corner, the kind of thing a careful man carries his whole life and leaves behind him when he is done. And she thought of her father's hands on it, and of her own hands, and of the cold March morning she had sat alone in 2 rooms in Brock Street, and decided that the law was the correct instrument. It had been, as it turned out, correct in several directions at once. Edward set his paper aside. He looked at the fire for a moment, and then he reached across and took her hand, and her calloused forefinger fit against his palm with the exactness of a thing that has found its right address, and neither of them said anything. And the frost worked on the glass. And the candle on the mantelpiece burned steadily in the still air of the room they had come to call their own. If Cecily's story moved you, leave a word in the comments. Thank you for staying until the end.